Chapter 16. What an extraordinary place, said Lucy. All those stone animals and people, too. It's like a museum. Shh, said Susan. Aslan's doing something. And he was indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. And then without waiting a moment, he whisked around, almost as if he had been a cat chasing his tail. And he breathed on the dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on the tall stone dryad, which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly and to deal with a stone rabbit on his right, then to two centaurs. And at that moment, Lucy said, Susan, look at the lion. I expect you've seen someone put a lighted match to a newspaper, which is propped up in a grate against an unlit fire, and for a second nothing seems to have happened. Then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper. It was like that now. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon the stone lion, it looked the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along the white marble back. Then it spread, and the color seemed to lick all over the flames, all over like a flame licks all over the paper. Then with his hind quarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane. The heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. And then he opened his great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a yawn. And now his hind legs had come to life. And he lifted one of them and scratched himself. And then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him and frisking around and whimpering with delight and jumping. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight of what they saw was so wonderful they forgot about him. Everywhere, statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum, but like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing around him until he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all the deadly white courtyard that was now a blaze of colors, glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, and dazzling plumage of birds. Reddy brown of foxes, dogs and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarfs, and the birch girls in silver, and the beech girls in fresh transparent green, and the larch girls in green so bright it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with a happy sound, roaring, braying, yelping, barking, squealing, cooing, neighing, stamping, shouts, hurrahs, songs, and laughter. Look! Is it safe? Said Susan. And Lucy looked and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of a stone giant. It's all right, said Aslan joyfully. Once the feet are put right, all the rest of him will follow. That wasn't exactly what I meant, said Susan to Lucy, but it was too late to do anything because now, even if Aslan would have listened to her, the change was already creeping up the giant's legs. He was now moving his feet, and a moment later he lifted his club from his shoulders and rubbed his eyes. Bless me, I must have been asleep. Where's that dreaded little witch that was running around on the ground? Somewhere just by my feet she was. When everyone shouted up to him and explained what had really happened, the giant put his hand to his ear and got them all to repeat it so he understood. And then he bowed down till his head was no further off the top of the haystack and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan, beaming all over his ugly face. Giants of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good-tempered, that 10 to 1 you have never seen a giant with his face beaming. It's a sight worth looking for. Now for the inside of the house, said Aslan. Look alive, everyone. Upstairs and downstairs and in the ladies' chambers. Leave no corner unsearched. You never know where a poor prisoner could be concealed. And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fusty old castle echoed with the opening of windows, and with everyone's voices crying out, Don't forget the dungeon! Give us a hand with this door! Here's another winding stair! Here's a poor kangaroo! Call Aslan! Woo, how it smells in here! Look out for the trap door! Up here there's a whole lot more on the landing! But the best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs, shouting out, Aslan, I found Mr. Tumnus! Come quick! And a moment later Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other by the hands and dancing around for joy. The little chap was none worse for having been a statue, that was of course very interested in all she had to tell him. But at last the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty, with every door and window and light on, and the sweet spring air flooding to the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and it was then that someone first said, Mr. Tumnus, I think. But how are we going to get out? For Aslan had got in by a jump and the gates were locked. It'll be all right. Hey, you up there, he said to the giant. What's your name? Giant Rumblebuffin. If it pleases your honor, sir. Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin, said Aslan, let us out of this place, will you? Certainly, it will be a pleasure. Stand away from the gates, little ones, he said. Then he strode to the gate himself, and bang, bang went his club. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side came thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust had cleared, standing in that dry, grim stone-yard to see the gaps in the grass and waving trees and sparkling streams of the forest and the blue hills beyond that and beyond the sky, the giant came puffing like a large railway engine. Comes of being out of condition, he said. I suppose neither of you young ladies has such a thing as a pocket handkerchief around you? I have, said Lucy, and she held her pocket handkerchief up as far as she could reach. Thanks, Missy, he said. The next moment, Lucy got a rather fright, for she found herself caught up in mid-air between the giant's fingers and thumb. But just as she was getting near his face, he suddenly started, and then he put her gently back on the ground. Bless me, I picked up a little girl instead of the hanky. Beg your pardon, Missy. I thought you were the hanky. No, here it is, she said. This time he managed to get it, but it was only about the same size to him as a tablet would be to you, so that when she saw him rubbing it to and fro across his red face, I'm afraid that's not going to be any use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin. Not at all. Never met a nicer hanky. So fine, so handy. I don't know how to describe it. What a nice giant he is. Oh, yes, said Mr. Tumnus. All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant that was clever. But an old family with traditions, you know. If he'd been the other sort, they'd never turned him into stone. At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for silence. Our day's work is not over. If the witch is to be finally defeated before bedtime, we must find the battle at once. And join in, I hope, said the centaurs. Of course. Now, those who can't keep up, that is, the children, the dwarfs, and the small animals, ride on the backs of those that can. The lions, the centaurs, the unicorns, the horses, giants, and eagles. Those who are good with their noses come to the front with the lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves. And with a great deal of bustle and cheering they did. The most pleased of the lot was the older lion, who kept running about everywhere pretending to be busy, but really in order to say to everyone he met, Did you hear what he said? Us lions? That means him and me. Us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No sides, no standoffishness. Us lions, me and him. And at last he went on saying this until Aslan loaded him up with 3 dwarfs, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. He steadied him a bit. We're ready. It was a big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan most in getting things sorted properly. They set out through the gap in the castle wall. At first, the lions and dogs went nosing about in all directions, and then suddenly one great hound picked up the scent and gave bay. There was no time lost after that. Soon all the dogs and the lions and the wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed with their noses to the ground, and all the others streaked out for about half a mile behind them, following as fast as they could. Noses like an English fox hunt, only better, because every now and then, with the music of the hounds, was a mixed roar of a lion or some other animal. Faster and faster they went, as the scent became easier to follow. And then, just as they came to the last curve in the narrow, winding valley, Lucy heard above all these noises another noise. One different one that gave her a weird feeling inside, a noise of shouts and shrieks and clashing metal. Then they came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There was Peter and Edmund and the rest of Aslan's army fighting desperately against the crowd of horrible creatures they had seen the night before. Only now in the daylight they looked even stranger and more evil and more deformed. They also seemed to be far more of them. Peter's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few, and there were statues dotted all over the battlefield, so apparently the witch had been using her wand. but she did not seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her knife. It was Peter she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing quickly. They looked like 3 knives and 3 swords. That pair was in the center, and on either side a line stretched out, horrible things happening wherever she looked. "Off my back, children," shouted Aslan. Then with a roar that shook all of Narnia, from the western lamppost to the shores of the eastern sea, with a great beast flung himself upon the White Witch. Lucy saw her face lifted toward him for 1 second, with an expression of terror and amazement. Then the lion and the witch rolled over together, but with the witch underneath, and at the same moment all warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly on the enemy lines. Dwarfs with their battle axes, dogs with their teeth, giants with his club, and his feet also crushing dozens of foe. Unicorns with their horns, centaurs and swords and hoofs, and Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemy squealed and gibbered till the wood re-echoed with the din of that onset.